This is an episode of Canon Founder Training. I'm Dom Ramirez, a software developer, designer, and entrepreneur in Boise, Idaho. Something I find non-technical founders underestimating pretty often is this distinction. What's the difference between freelance developers, offshore teams, agencies, and enterprise firms? Ultimately, all of these structures do the same thing. They build software, but despite the similarity of their high-level goal, these organizations can vary pretty widely from each other in cost, time, and quality. Fair warning, I'll be generalizing here just a little bit. These impressions come from my decade of experience in both hiring these service providers and providing these services to clients. So let's talk about freelancers first. I was a freelancer for a few years of my life, on and on, as both a designer and a developer. Most developers have freelanced either after work or between jobs at some point. But overall, here are the pros that I've seen from hiring freelancers. For one, they're inexpensive, pound for pound. An efficiently utilized freelancer can give you lots of bang for your buck. Another big upside is that you, the client, get lots of access and control. You can often stipulate meeting with your freelancer as often as daily if you want. Freelancers have to get paid no matter what, so they're usually willing to bend over backwards in order to get a project across the finish line. But freelancers can also be kind of flaky. They have less to lose, so it's not uncommon for them to just disappear when projects become infeasible because they've bent over too far backward trying to accommodate you. Freelancing is pretty hard on the developer, and managing clients, that's you once again, is cited as the hardest part. But also, every person is limited in how much they can do and how wide their skills go. So, one freelancer is only one person, and they can only fill maybe one or two roles well. And after that, they're stretching. Ultimately, I suggest a freelancer if the budget for your app is less than $10,000, you're ready to put in a lot of effort into managing the freelancer, the product scope is absolutely tiny, and you're willing to fire the freelancer and find somebody else if things don't work out. One big tip I have for hiring freelancers is this. Start with a tiny starter project and see how they do. Then expand the scope from there. One of my old business partners used to say, we need to figure out how to date before we get married. So now onto offshore teams. It's pretty common to look at the currency exchange rate between the United States and India, plan to spend bottom dollar for a development team in India, take the service provider's yes at face value, and hope the project turns out exactly like you wanted. As common as this expectation is, my guess is that it only works out that way maybe 5% of the time. I've dabbled in hiring overseas developers myself several times, and it's been successful sometimes, but it usually failed for me in one way or another. Some people specialize in this kind of work though. So if you have a real proven track record of results while managing a global team, that's an asset. I never hire overseas teams anymore, which might give you an idea of how the following pros and cons list is going to go. That said, I know of some firms who hire outsourced developers and teams exclusively, and they see satisfiable results, which I credit to them having multiple full-time in-house employees whose sole purpose is to manage those outsourced developers. Here are the upsides of going with an offshore team. They're very inexpensive, hour by hour. While developer hourly rates in India, Vietnam, and Macedonia have long since risen above the fabled $2 an hour rate, they're still incredibly cheap compared to US developers. Some overseas developers and teams are quite good, despite being relatively expensive. If you can source a full team overseas at the cost of a single US-based developer, you gain access to a wider set of skills than you would from a freelancer. But here are some of the downsides. When I hire offshore teams, I expect less progress per hour. I also expect to have a very, very hands-on management approach. Like, you have to know exactly what you want, and you can't expect to get over the language barrier by just asking questions and sending sketches on napkins. The time zone difference and language barrier and the cultural differences make managing difficult, and it takes a skill to get over that. If you think an offshore team is right to you, I'd say you should expect a big part of your job, maybe even your full-time job, to be making sure that your expectations are very clear and reviewing the work that you receive. If you don't have experience in that role, I'd recommend avoiding offshore teams entirely. So now for boutique agencies and specialty teams. I think pretty much any professional company with a small team developing real software qualifies for this category, at least aspirationally. Let's rule out agencies that only do WordPress sites and creative advertising agencies for today. In this category, I'm grouping together boutique agencies, which I see as small development companies who take advantage of their smallness to provide high quality products, and teams who specialize in a specific service, such as teams of Salesforce developers or teams who only build apps for a particular industry. Some companies are both. Full disclosure, Canon is this kind of company. We work with a team of 5 US-based professionals, and we specialize in building brand new apps for startups. So here are some of the upsides of going with a specialty boutique agency. The most successful of these firms provide a good mix of value, quality, and responsiveness. These teams usually know each other pretty well, making them a bit more likely to set commitments and meet them. These firms often work on a fixed price basis because of that. Specialty teams also get really good at a particular thing. They're usually better at their specialty than large firms are at anything. With everything, there are downsides too. These smaller companies have a limited capacity, which means that the people running them have to be vigilant, and they have to say no when a project doesn't fit their model. If they don't say no when they should, they risk their whole company and probably your project along with it. Specialty teams also might have a limited range. For example, my company, Canon, is amazingly good at building new apps, but we couldn't develop a WordPress site to save our lives. So here's another thing. Smaller companies, especially the good ones, have fewer mouths to feed. Therefore, they might be much more picky about the kinds of clients that they bring on. If you aren't a fit for their model, they might just refer you somewhere else. If you're thinking this might be the category for you, then you should probably go to betacanon.com and get a consultation right now. The best service provider might just be the one you know. Looking past my shameless plug, these companies can often be very different. If you think that this is the category for you, make sure that the company has the skills that you need and that they aren't just stretching themselves by taking your project on. Oftentimes, you might be able to have them complete some part of your project while having a freelancer or another team perform another part. Now, finally, let's talk about enterprise firms. Entrepreneurs often talk to enterprise firms first because they're the biggest, they often look the coolest, they have tons of great PR, and they seem to be the most established of the options. That said, enterprise firms are best for a particular kind of client, enterprises. Lots of overhead and redundancy goes into serving that kind of client consistently. I'm intimately aware of these dynamics. I once co-founded and ran an enterprise services firm. We served, and they still serve, Fortune 500 companies, state governments, Ivy League institutions, etc. And I left that company because I love startups. But in my experience, they often work in a very similar way, with a good-sized monthly retainer and a time and materials way of billing. They usually don't do fixed price projects, but when they do, you can bet that they added a lot of padding to protect their downside. Understandably so. So here are some upsides to hiring an enterprise firm. For one, they manage themselves for the most part, and they innovate without requiring much effort from their clients. They usually have a very wide set of skills, especially if you have a big budget, and often they'll outsource for skills that they don't have in-house. They usually outsource more effectively than smaller agencies. Enterprise firms also have a lot to lose. It's unlikely that they're going to disappear on you or let a project fail miserably. Not to say that those things never happen. But here are some downsides of enterprise firms. They're incredibly slow, like slower than you might think possible. They're also very expensive. Imagine the concept of expensive in your mind and then multiply that by 10. You should also keep in mind that your contact at the firm is probably going to have a lot of irons in the fire and a lot of interests to manage at the same time. So if you have some kind of special requirement, you may find yourself repeating it pretty frequently before it actually reaches everybody on the project. That's me painting with a broad brush. It can be hard to classify these 4 different kinds of service providers, especially since freelancers can be part-time, full-time, offshore, US-based. Agencies or firms can use any number between 0 and hundreds of freelancers or other firms to get their workload handled. And both part-time freelancers and gigantic service firms can be highly specialized or very general. There are always exceptions here, but the fact that somebody is an exception should be obvious to you, not just wishful thinking. It's a complicated world out there, but I hope these archetypes have helped you decide who to hire for your next project. If you're not sure who would fit best, feel free to request a free consultation from my company at betacanon.com. And even if you're not a good fit for our model, we might be able to point you in the right direction. If you have thoughts, feelings, or questions about this video, leave me a comment or send me an email at dom@betacanon.com.